Well, it's a real honor to be with you today, and the only reason I think the bishops kept us in as a home teaching in Lavelle is that I had 7 sons, and and some of them became football players. At any rate, it's great to be here, and I hope that we have the Spirit with us today. This collection started as a result of a fire that I observed at age 7. My grandmother, who I don't know well because she passed away when I was only a year old, we called her Nana. She had died in 1950. And my grandfather, Pop, as we called him, who I was very close to, passed away the day we were taping up little trees that are huge now on the west, what's now the west parking lot of Brick Oven Restaurant, those of you that know Provo a little bit. At any rate, Pop had never had the heart to go through my grandmother's things, and I remember him saying that he couldn't pull his Buick into the garage, but he didn't really care. He didn't want to go through her things. Well, after he passed away, the boys came together. My mother was the youngest of 6 children, and they created a big bonfire, and they started throwing everything in. And I remember looking at this fire. I can even remember Grandpa's false teeth in the ashes and wondering what went up in smoke. It's interesting what a 7-year-old remembered. But I asked my mother, pestered her over the years, did you guys save anything from grandmother's belongings? And my mom said yes. There was one box. It was up in the rafters of the garage. And we saw it, but we were too busy with everything else. And I asked her dad, we were the only family living there at the time, and then his basement, when we moved, to get that box down. And by the time I was a deacon in the church, I guess I'd pestered enough, and we just moved, my father being an architect, on the west side of Provo into a new home. That was 1957, and so it was a few years later when I was a deacon. And she said, well, yeah, that box is out there somewhere, and I pestered her until we found it. And she says, now, we've never been through it. You can have it. It was lucky it didn't get destroyed. Yes, it was lucky. It was lucky my grandmother had Grandpa put it up into the rafters of the garage. There were 13 letters of Heber J. Grant in that box, written to my grandmother between 1931 and 33. And they were all in reaction to an initial letter where she felt that her being a convert to the church, that her son, who was serving a mission in Texas at the time during the Great Depression, maybe they couldn't afford to keep him out. My grandfather, pressed for money at the time, felt that he couldn't afford the $25 a month that was standard for a missionary in 1931. And so he thought the boy ought to come home, and she disagreed and wrote the president of the church. And that started a correspondence on many subjects. But President Grant wrote her sometimes 3 pages in dictated letters, and then with his beautiful signature at the end, exhorting her to keep this son on a mission. Well, I was reading these letters from 30 years later, and I thought, isn't this great? I know more about President Grant reading these letters than anything I'd heard in junior Sunday school. Wouldn't it be nice if I could collect something personal of each president of the church? Well, that's what got me started. Most collectors have something in mind, collection. And I feel like I've been aided and abetted by the Lord in the direction that I've gone over the years. And I know I've had his help. One immediate example of that is I brought 3 Bibles with me. You can see the big books on the table here, tables. The one over there, Tammy already mentioned to you, and that's the Bradford Bible. Take a look at these. It was brought over in the Mayflower. It's one of the few books we know that was brought over in the Mayflower because Bradford wrote of it in his will. And he'd borrowed the book from a friend, Jesse DeForest, who was going to come to America the next year after the Mayflower arrived in 1620. Only DeForest's ship went to the bottom of the ocean, the Atlantic, and he never picked up his book, so the family eventually just told Bradford he could keep it, and they did come to America. And so Bradford listed among those that he brought to America. Let's see, there we go. I get used to this. Okay. And so this is the Bradford Bible, and it's signed by William Bradford right on the title page. In fact, it was printed in Leyden, Holland. That's where the separatists went because they weren't allowed to worship God the way they had wanted to. And so they went to Holland. And they were there for a number of years. You can see this Bible. It's actually the Calvin on the Gospels. They were Calvinists. Was printed in Leiden, their town, in 1601. So it was 19 more years before they came to America attempted to on two ships. The Speedwell, it didn't speed so well and leaked. And the Mayflower that held sturdy. You can imagine those passengers, including DeForest, that had to get off the Speedwell, how disappointed they must have been. But as many as could were put aboard the Mayflower. And at the last minute, somebody decided, do we need to bring Brewster's printing press with us? And, it takes up space that we don't have. You imagine 102 people crammed aboard a ship, only the top 2 decks of which they could inhabit. The bottom ones were full of ballast on the bottom, keep the ship aright, rocks, and then 2 decks of supplies. My earliest ancestor to come to America, John Alden, was not a particularly religious man at the time. He was only 19 years old when he was brought as an assistant to Miles Standish to protect the Pilgrims in the new land. And they decided to bring this printing press at the last minute, even though they didn't have a whole lot of room for the people that were aboard. About halfway across the Atlantic, as some of you may know, the main beam of the Mayflower broke in a huge storm. And they would have been lost, like his friend DeForest was a year later, had they not had that printing press and somebody been inspired to bring it there to hold up the main beam for the remainder of the trip. As fortune would have it, of the 102 passengers, they lost 1 during the 2.5 months passage, and 1 baby was born, so the number was 102 when they landed, but about half of them died that first winter, and that was a terrible loss to all of them. At any rate, the other Bible that I brought down from that is the Joseph Smith and Emma Smith family Bible, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then finally, the Bible on the end down here, and this again makes my point that I've felt directed over the years to collect the things I have. And I've got to give credit to my Heavenly Father for his direction, to be honest with you, and because it's the truth. Yesterday, this Bible on the end was made known to me. It belonged to Elias S. Kimball. I don't know if any of you know his name, but he was actually the first LDS chaplain. Isn't it ironic that it came my way yesterday? He had served as a president of the Southern States Mission up until 6 months before the time appointed by the president when he sent him there, President Lorenzo Snow, and was suddenly released 6 months early and called to be the first chaplain in the United States Army that we had from our faith. In 1898, 6 months early, served with distinction in Chicago and then with the unit as it went to Cuba to serve. It's kind of interesting. I can see the hand of the Lord in preserving these items as well as in leading me and others towards preserving them. I'll just mention a few other items that I think are really exciting in this collection. Over the years, I picked some favorites, but Sammy mentioned the collection's getting kind of huge. And my wife calls this stuff the miscellaneous. And I'd like to pay tribute to her because we moved out of one house because it became a museum, and we may be getting ready to do another. I don't know, another move, I'm not sure. But the miscellaneous has run out of places to hide, so even though I went on a search for these pieces, they were wonderful pieces I wanted to share. The first letter I brought here today is a letter of George Washington. Now, the colonists had just gotten word, a year and a half almost after Yorktown, the last battle, that Fat George, our king, I guess I shouldn't call him that, but I could call him Insane George, because he was insane, was about to lose his colonies, was about to give up on his efforts to have us not win our independence. And there was great jubilation when we found that there were not going to be any more hired Germans brought over to fight us. One of those who sent a letter of congratulations to the general was Dr. John Rogers, the Episcopal Bishop of New York. And Rogers wrote a very flowery letter, which is in the Madison Library of Congress now, and I read a microfilm version of it when I acquired this letter about 35 years ago. And in that letter, he said, "Your name's now going to be known general throughout all our history. They're going to be building roads, thoroughfares, and naming them after you. They're going to be naming states and territories after you. And what's more, they're going to probably be naming children after you." And all of those things came to pass and more over time. Indeed, Washington was first in the hearts of his people at that time. Washington could have taken a big bow on that letter, but this is how he responded in this wonderful letter to a chaplain. "I accept with much pleasure your kind congratulations on the happy event of peace with the establishment of our liberties and independence. Glorious indeed has been our contest, glorious if we consider the prize for which we have contended, and glorious in its issue. But in the midst of our joys, I hope we shall not forget that to divine providence is to be ascribed the glory and the praise." This was a great man. You see why we won? That kind of leader, yeah. It's the kind of leader America needs now, needs many of now. The letter of John Adams I brought, the letter of Washington, I think, stands for the proposition of humility and gratitude towards God in the time of celebration or jubilation. This letter of John Adams, it was John Adams, you know, who's starting to get a little more credit now. I need to move this forward, I'm sorry. This is the signature. It's interesting, the scribe on the Washington letter was Jonathan Trumbull. The United States was known as Brother Jonathan before we were known as Uncle Sam for a long time. That didn't come till 1812. But that's because the father of this man that wrote this letter, and then George Washington signed it, having dictated, and added a paragraph in his own handwriting. So you can see Washington's handwriting is actually prettier than was the scribe's. But the father of that man was the governor of Connecticut, and one of the few that remained loyal to the radical cause, if you want to call it, the rebels. And oftentimes George Washington would say, "Well, let's find out what Brother Jonathan has to say about this problem." One time, for instance, they didn't have enough shirts to put on his men. Well, let's contact Brother Jonathan and see if he can send us some shirts. So the United States became Brother Jonathan to the world, like I say, up until the War of 1812, when we switched to Uncle Sam. John Adams wrote this letter to fellow signer Benjamin Rush, the doctor of the Revolution, his good friend who he'd sat in the First Continental Congress in 1774 and the second when it followed. And he's discussing his religion, but he starts his letter out, "You may descend in a calm, but I have lived for 50 years in a storm and will certainly die in one." And that's the way he began his letter. It's tiny writing. It's hard for you to read, and because the largest signature I've ever seen of the United States president in office is John Adams. You can see my hands, but I've seen one that big on documents. I've got one that's that big. The tiniest signature of any president of the United States I've seen when he's out of office is John Adams. And the signature on this, if you can see it, is quite tiny, okay? There have been studies on that made by famous individuals. Napoleon stands out as one of the big ones. He was Bonaparte to the French when he was consul to Cairo. When he declared himself emperor in 1804, it was Napoleon, huge Napoleon. I've got a document that has his full signature. The document itself's huge. And then as he got into attacking Russia and other things, trying to take over the world, his signature got shorter. It was Napole for a while, and then it was Nap for a while, and anybody wants to come to my shop can see a Nap one. And then when he was exiled after having lost at Waterloo, his signature just ended in an N. That's all it was. He just signed an N. And then the N got tinier over time on St. Helena and Elba. At any rate, other studies have done of others, but John Adams certainly wore his signature on his emotions. And in this letter to Dr. Benjamin Rush, he starts out by saying, "You may descend in a calm, but I have lived for 50 years in a storm and will certainly die in one." That's how he starts his letter. And then he ends it by taking on those who say he's not a Christian. And I call this belief in the attributes of God. The Christian religion, as I understand it, is the brightness of the glory, an express portrait of the character of the eternal, self-existent, independent, benevolent, all-powerful, and all-merciful creator, preserver, and father of the universe. The first good, first perfect, and first fair. It will last as long as the world. Neither savage nor civilized man without a revelation could ever have discovered or invented it. Ask me not, then, whether I am a Catholic or Protestant, Calvinist or Armenian. As far as they are Christians, I wish to be a fellow disciple with them all. I think that's fairly clear, don't you? Sometimes when our founding fathers get questioned, you have to look at what they actually wrote. Thomas Jefferson, great writer. It was Adams that picked Washington, incidentally, as head of the War Committee over his friend John Hancock, who wanted to leave Congress and lead the troops too. He thought Hancock was okay to suffer in Congress, but he'd be a miserable leader on the battlefield, luckily. And it needed, his argument went over by saying it needed to be from someone from the big central southern border state of Virginia. And he said the same thing when it came to writing the Declaration of Independence a few years later as head of the drafting committee. And when he picked Thomas Jefferson over himself, it was because even though he was equally a good writer, he was hated and despised, to use his own words, and nothing that he had written, including the Declaration of Independence, if he were to do so, would be passed by Congress. So he picked a man who had said almost no more than 3 words in the Congress. Very quiet man by the name of Thomas Jefferson, who had been a great writer, though, had articulated himself very well in writing. And here we are with Jefferson in his later years, writing to a professor at the university that he established there at Charlottesville, below his home. If in the course of my political term of service, I have effected anything useful for our country, my reward is in their approbation. I am thankful that I have lived to see the sacrifices of the revolutionary generation, whatever they may have been, result in so great a share of happiness of their descendants. And, you know, folks, we're the descendants now. And that they, us, may perpetuate and improve these blessings will be my last prayer. I've already mentioned the Bible of the prophet Joseph Smith and his wife Emma. And this is one of the pages that are written on, the one that I have opened here. And the left column is written by the prophet in his handwriting, wherein he writes the names of those he grew up with, his parents, Joseph Sr., Lucy Smith, Alvin, his big brother that was always so interested in the work before his passing, Hiram, his big brother that sealed his testimony with him at Carthage on June 27th, 44, and then some of his sisters and so on, all the way down, including Samuel, the first missionary of the church, and William Smith, one of the first pains in the neck in the Quorum of the 12. And Don Carlos, who lost his life as he was publishing at a very young age. I think he was 25, 26 years old. The Times and Seasons got sick and died, and their younger sister Lucy. On the other side, and including the bottom, Isaac Hill's family, Emma has started taking up the pen, and she writes of her family, the Hales, her parents, Isaac and Elizabeth. And then she writes on the right-hand column her husband's name and hers and their children. Now, the unique thing about this, including the little squiggly line between the twins that she raised that were given to her. At any rate, if you drop down to the next to last line that she's written on the right-hand page, she's got Thomas, and she's written 7th son, February 6, 1842. This is a son we didn't know existed before this Bible showed up about 45 years ago. You see the importance of preserving records? This is the Smith family that we think we know so well. And here's the son we knew nothing about, and she wanted to make sure that Thomas, her 7th son, was not forgotten. Moving on, one of the great men of history, and certainly of this area, is Brigham Young. Brigham Young, if you get over to the new museum, it's been reopened, I saw it last week, remarkable what they've done. Be sure not to miss the First Vision film. It's only 6 minutes long, and it incorporates almost every point in the 14 different versions. 14 times Joseph was told it to others and added additional facts as he remembered them. But there's a four-sided desk up there in Brigham Young's section. Imagine being governor and prophet, president of the church, head of Indian Affairs, and many other important titles out here for years. So he had to keep different clerks going on different letters till he got additional thoughts to add to those. He's writing one of his sons. Imagine having 4 sons named Brigham. They went by their middle names, and so he's writing to Morris. And Morris is served on out in the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, and was having difficulty with the language. No MTCs or LTMs or whatever at that point, or mission homes. And Brigham, about halfway down that page, says, "I know full well you will give it. You'll learn the language." And he says, "Never allow your courage to fail you." And this letter stands, I think, for maintaining courage. Never allow your courage to fail you. Man's greatest works have been done by men of patience, perseverance, and a determined will, which would acknowledge no defeat, rather than by those gifted with a natural ability, which made success easy, but who lack the tenaciousness of purpose. Then, my boy, never say fail, but work on in the way you have started, and your reward is certain. What great advice. I love that letter. And the funny thing about it, if you want to call it funny, was that my father, when my mother died of cancer back in '77, gave me a book that was just off the press, Deseret Press. It was the letters of Brigham Young to his sons. It was by a man that became a very close friend of mine later, who actually started the Joseph Smith Project, Dean Jesse. And at any rate, I had gone through that book. I'd read it. My father's inscription is still in the copy that I found his copy years later. I put it away, and it's not easy for me to find things sometimes, as my wife knows. I found that book. I had other copies of it, but that's the one that meant a lot to me, and I was grateful to see it with my dad's inscription on my mother's death. I was also curious by the fact, over the 20 or 30 years that I'd missed it since then, that I had just marked one letter to one son in that book. And that's the letter that I acquired since, and which I just read to you. So I think there's a little more than just coincidence in these collectibles. At any rate, the next letter is, this is Brigham's signature on his letter, also dictated. And this letter may be difficult to read for both of us, but I thought it was so powerful. One of Brigham's many wives came from a very wealthy family in Boston. And American Heritage Magazine did an article many years ago with Brigham Young on the hardcover of the front of the magazine, and an article entitled To Her Who Shall Remain Nameless on the inside. And that's the way the family referred to Augusta Adams Cobb Young, a wealthy lady who gave up her wealth, gave up her home for the man she had married when he'd been on a missionary trip to Boston early on, Brigham Young. And her daughter Charlotte was already living with President Young, and she wrote this letter from Fort Laramie as she's crossing the plains herself. Now, Brigham chose for the saints to cross to go across on the north side of the Platte, north side of the river, across the way. He did this because many of the saints' enemies were crossing on the south side, and he'd rather take his chances, he said, with the Lamanites. Well, the Lamanites didn't see themselves quite the way the Mormons did in Scripture, so there were attacks and there were unfortunate incidents along the north side. But that's the way they went, and Charlotte's mother, Augusta Adams Cobb Young, is crossing on the north, and they're at Fort Laramie now. And she said, she says that she's 5 miles by the Laramie's fort, and she says, our camp, generally speaking, together with myself and all others, are in good health. And we have been greatly blessed while traveling this far as a company. And I feel as if the angels of heaven was in our midst, and before us as well as in our rear. For the Indians appear to have fled before us and left us to pass on unmolested thus far. And it is my prayer that we may duly acknowledge the hand of our Heavenly Father in this, as well as all things else. Powerful reminder of who we look to for divine protection. Skipping back to American history, one of my favorite people that I think Joseph was referring to when he said we have many prophets not of our faith was Abraham Lincoln. I think he was raised to the occasion and served a mission for our nation and for the gospel, really, during the Civil War. Imagine being the most hated man ever to sit in the executive mansion. When I tell people that Lincoln was by far the most hated president in our history, they laugh at me, but he was. You know, what other president's election caused the states to leave? That's a poll that you wouldn't want to win. As bad as things may seem in more recent years, nobody's had that kind of response, but they did with Lincoln. And his whole career, his whole life was to try to bring the illegal rebellion, as he looked at it, he was an attorney, to an end. And the old estimates of 600,000 lost have been run up to about 750,000 in that war, if you include half of them as civilians who died of various things during the war. 4 months after the war's beginning at the bombardment of Fort Sumter on April 12th of 1861, Lincoln signed this document, which you can see is August 12th, 1861. The war's not going to be over anytime soon. And so he issues an order to the Secretary of State to put the United States seal on my proclamation appointing a day of humiliation, prayer, and fasting. Lincoln's great belief, this was the first National Prayer Day. We often think of him as putting a Thanksgiving on the permanent map, but he started out with a National Prayer Day. And that was a day in September, which was set by this. Just a little of the wording of this document as it went out. This is the one that was issued for Maine under that seal. When our beloved country, once by the blessing of God united, prosperous, and happy, is now afflicted with faction and civil war, it is peculiarly fit for us to recognize the hand of God in this visitation and in sorrowful remembrance of our own faults and crimes as a nation, and as individuals to humble ourselves before him and to pray for his mercy. And with those, in other words, he extended the day of prayer into September. Well, the war still went on, as we know, for several long years, and Lincoln ultimately, although he originally believed that the war would be over soon, and that his oath on the Bible, which meant the most to him because he was raised on the Bible, had never joined a formal religion as such, but he believed the Bible. And he took an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So when Horace Greeley and the other abolitionists came to him in anger and said, "Look, Mr. President, why aren't you freeing the slaves?" I mean, that's why half of them left the Union. He said, "Well, that's not in my oath. My oath was to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. If I can," Mr. Greeley wrote for his paper this letter, which, as you know, is quite famous. "If I can do that by freeing all the slaves, I'll do it. If I can do it by freeing some of the slaves, I'll do it. If I can preserve the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I'll do it," because that was his oath. All that changes after the death of Willie in the White House, but I'll let you read a little about that yourself. But in 1862, the year he finally got a victory, and he'd been driven to his knees, where his wife had been driven on the verge of insanity by the death of Willie in the White House in 1862. Lincoln was told by Mrs. Lincoln that her cousin's son, a young cadet at West Point by the name of Quentin Campbell. I never went to West Point, but I was in the military, and I did serve during Vietnam stateside, but I did go in the Army the day after the moon landing to Fort Ord. And my father served with distinction, as did my father-in-law, in World War II. So we have a tradition of military service in our family. But Lincoln was told by Mary, this young cadet, the son of her cousin, was ready to quit West Point. Have any of you ever felt like quitting something? And he'd only just started. He'd only just begun. It was a little harder than he thought it was going to be. Any of you started your military training and felt like maybe it's a little more difficult than what you were cut out for? This was a horrible day in Lincoln's career. He had a lot of bad ones. But on June 28, 1862, and I need to get that letter up here. Is that the right one? Nope, that's Robert E. Lee. I didn't put that one in. Sorry, go back. We'll talk about that one next. On June 28, 1862, Lincoln wrote a letter to McClellan, his general. You remember him, the guy that wanted to march the troops, needed more guns, ammunition, and men than he had available, even though it was all the North could send him. And Lincoln had sent a letter on the same day this letter was written to the young cadet to McClellan, starting out by saying, "Save your army at all costs." That's the way that letter starts. But he took the time to write this young cadet, Quentin Campbell, "My dear sir, your good mother tells me you are feeling very badly in your new situation. Allow me to assure you it is a perfect certainty that you will, very soon, feel better, quite happy, if you only stick to the resolution you have taken to procure a military education. I am older than you, have felt badly myself, and know," underline, "what I tell you is true. Adhere to your purpose, and you will soon feel as well as you ever did. On the contrary, if you falter and give up, you will lose the power of keeping any resolution and will regret it all your life. Take the advice of a friend who, though he never saw you, deeply sympathizes with you, and stick to your purpose. Sincerely your friend, A. Lincoln." Can you imagine getting a letter from the president that said that, West Point, that you weren't expecting? Young Quentin Campbell did complete his military career and graduated the year after the Civil War ended in 1866. Robert E. Lee, this is a letter written in defeat by Robert E. Lee. He's just lost the war. It's December of 1865. Not a bunch of happy things going on in the South here. There was even some push to have Lee and Davis and the others hung. That went away. Of course, Lincoln, who would have been more friendly to the South and its leaders, had been assassinated a few months before. On April 15th, he'd passed away. And Robert E. Lee writes this to a lady who had, Miss Grace Shreve, who had written, giving a gift on behalf of the suffering citizens of the South. "I return my earnest thanks for your beautiful gift and for your deep sympathy with the South. You will receive the fervent gratitude of her suffering citizens. Your tears and prayers in their behalf, I am sure, will be accepted by Him who never unnecessarily afflicts His people, and who has pleasure in lightening their sorrows and in crowning them with mercies and kindness." This was from the man that was given the total leadership of the Army of the United States at the beginning of the war, and paced the floor at his wife's home, Arlington, Mary Custis, the granddaughter of George Washington, Mary and Martha, and decided to go with his native South, that he couldn't raise the sword against Virginia. The Union was so disturbed over his going to the South that they started burying their dead around Arlington, around Lee's home. And you know the rest of the story. Well, I think we need a little humor. I think humor is a virtue, too. And this is humor in conversation. I quote from the prophet Joseph Smith, a couple of things you might not have heard. This is from an article written by David Nye White. As far as I know, the only editor of a major newspaper in the United States that left his Pittsburgh Gazette in this place. Joseph had correspondence with Bennett and others over the years, but they never came to Nauvoo to search him out. And I think, reading through the lines of this article, he went to expose a fraud, somebody, an imposter, because even though after he had met the prophet, the title of this article is A Visit to the Mormon Imposter. Now, if you get a chance to go see the wonderful 6-minute film I've mentioned, which I saw last week, that's over in the New Church Museum, go do it. It's wonderful. It's amazing. But David Nye White wanted to go and interview this man that thought he could run for president of the United States. I don't mean to cast aspersions, but I think if we were to think of doing an interview with maybe David Jeffs or something, or whatever his name is, it might give us the same idea what this guy was thinking of at the time he sought out Joseph Smith. He went to Warsaw, which wasn't exactly the place of support for Joseph. And he got ill, and he was there for a couple of weeks, and he wrote to his junior editor this article. So he said, "I've been ill for a couple of weeks and thought I should explain that eventually I made a trip to Nauvoo, and it's a broken down place that you wouldn't want to go to. It's horrible. It's awful. The Mormons can't do anything right," and, just so on. But he did take a reporter with him. And this was the beauty of this interview, as he at least had the integrity to let the prophet, quote, hang himself, unquote. And so the two of them together took down every word that Joseph had. And he said the next morning after breakfast, we paid a visit to the prophet. And I won't read you all that in the interest of time, but He was asked by the reporter who accompanied me, asking him how he prospered, and he replied, quote, "None can get ahead of me, and few can keep behind me." And then the prophet laughed. Now here he knows he's got somebody that's gunning for him, but yet he still has a sense of humor. And this is one of the great aspects of the prophet that sometimes we forget about. He went on to discuss politics with the men, and he says, "I'm a Whig." That was the predecessors of the Republicans Lincoln was first elected by. He was a Whig too. He says, "I am a clay man, and I'm made of clay, and I'm tending to clay, and I'm going to vote for Henry Clay, and that's the way I feel," and then it's got to laugh. This was the prophet's words. He knew his audience. He knew that they were after hearing him talk about multiple gods and other things. The prophet says this, in quotes, "I have sworn by the eternal gods," and he says it's no harm to swear by the gods because there is none. If there's only but one God, there can't be gods, and it's no harm to swear by nothing, and then they've got to laugh. Again, the prophet was having fun with these men. But he went on to give a powerful testimony of his first vision and so on, which I may share if we have time. But at any rate, I wanted to also read, before we get to another man that had a great sense of humor, Teddy Roosevelt. The virtue of humor is important. It's one we need to not forget. The prophet Joseph Smith had a sense of humor. I think, was it Abe Lincoln that said, "The good Lord must have a sense of humor because he made so many common people." And Lincoln came in contact with most of them. He had an open door policy. It's wonderful. Wonder Lincoln wasn't shot. They've actually noted over 80 attempts on Lincoln's life, but he wasn't killed after the war was done. Kind of like Joseph would say later, the same newspaper guy, that he was protected until his mission was over, and I think that was correct. Here's Mark Twain. I love Mark Twain, and I thought this would be a little bit of humor. The question is, did Mark Twain and Abe Lincoln ever meet? Probably not, but it would have been hard to have not heard the ceiling or some of the windows crack in laughter if they had met together. Twain wrote this in New Orleans in 1896. "When the Lord finished the world, he pronounced it good." That's what I said about my first work too. But time, I tell you, time takes the confidence out of these incautious early opinions. It is more than likely that he thinks about the world now pretty much as I think of The Innocents Abroad, which was his first big novel. The fact is, there's a trifle too much water in both. We've got to be able to smile at ourselves and laugh occasionally. Theodore Roosevelt, I got this picture years ago at auction, and I thought it really showed the character and the vitality of our youngest president. No, it wasn't Kennedy. Kennedy was the youngest elected, but the youngest man to become president was Teddy Roosevelt. Now, he started out as an Eastern slicker, but you know what? He had a day in 1881 where the two loves of his life, the two biggest loves of his life, his mother and his wife, died on the same day. And Teddy wrote in his journal words to the effect that this was the end of his life. His life was over. Well, a few days later, he decided to head west. He was a New York City slicker. He became a cowpuncher the next few years, became well known in the West. When he finally was president himself and had his own inaugural that he could invite people to, he invited people like Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, and Geronimo, who was a federal prisoner at the time, and got to wear Eastern duds with a top hat and an arrow, or I mean a feather out the back of his hat. Then went back to prison after. Any rate, that was Teddy. He was born as a sickly person. Talk about someone that changed their circumstances. His father used to say, don't let Teddy do anything because he's going to die on you if you give him a job or whatever. This was his father. Well, Teddy decided to live what he called the strenuous life. And he worked out half his days to get himself in a condition. And like I say, he did go out west and punch cattle later after the tragic deaths of both his mother and his wife. He had a young daughter, Alice, at the time, whom he gave to his sister to raise. By the time John F. Kennedy was president, Alice Roosevelt was kind of the head of the social circuit in Washington, D.C., and a real pain in the neck in a lot of ways, but she had a lot of the fight in her that her father had. This is a letter on family life. that I think really explains a lot about him. He's writing some couple of ladies that said they were opposed to ever getting married or having children, and he responds, "I love the short story of married life and shall show it to Mrs. Roosevelt. Oh, how well I remember our small figures in the little bed next to us, looking steadily over the railing, and if they detected the slightest movement on my part, instantly swarming over with, 'Now, Father, we would like a story.'" Of course, Mrs. Roosevelt had an infinitely harder time with the children than I had, and did infinitely more. But I'm thankful to say that I did do some things myself, and whenever Mrs. Roosevelt was away, and I tried my best to get her off whenever I could, I would act as vice mother until her return and be at the children's tea and tell them stories, etc., etc. Then, if there was sickness in the house, I would try to take my share of the work, although Mrs. Roosevelt did infinitely more, and especially when we had to divide between ourselves the superintendents of the convalescents, and if those children had not yet come down with measles or whatever it was. I still remember vividly one morning when the whole family seemed to be in varying stages of the measles, and while the long-suffering mother was trying to get some much-needed sleep, I lay down on the sofa beside Ted's bed. Now, this is General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. later, the only D-Day general that received the Congressional Medal of Honor. He passed away of a heart attack after that, after going ashore at that beach, the only major general that went ashore, the Americans on that particular day. At any rate, this is Ted, and he said, having, as I felt, won the right to repose by a story he'd given Ted, he said, I said, "Now, Ted, Father's told you a story, and he thinks he would like to go to sleep for a while." To which Ted cordially responded, "All right," and Ted will play the organ, which he proceeded to do at a distance of 2 feet from my head, with the evident feeling that he was showing virtuous self-abnegation. And then he adds this, "How sincerely I pity such clever girls as the writers whom you quote, the ones that didn't want to get married or have family. In every kind of life," get this, "in every kind of life, the greatest happiness only comes where there's a chance for great unhappiness. But how sincerely I despise the cold or timid or selfish souls that dare not try the great adventure, because it is given to no human being to be certain of joy and not of sorrow." The story goes when McKinley was shot, and they purposely stuck TR in the vice presidency, which he said was the most worthless position ever created by the mind of man. And suddenly he's thrust in the presidency as McKinley shot at the Buffalo Exposition in 1901. They had to go on safari, on hunt, to find him because he was climbing a peak in upper New York at the time. And supposedly the man from the then Secret Service, who was fairly new, said, "Mr. President," he said, the president is dead, Mr. President. I think those were his words. And that's how he entered into it. Well, it was TR that made America into a world power. He sent the Great White Fleet around. He said, "Speak softly, carry a big stick." And it was during the period that he was there, one of the greatest ladies that I think ever lived wrote the letter I'm going to show to you. And I'm not going to talk about him yet, but this is also one. This is of Helen Keller, and she was 17 years old. Imagine being born to a wealthy family in Tuscumbia, Alabama, and she had no ills until a few short months after her birth, when she was a young child. And as a result of a terrible fever, she lost both her eyesight, her voice, and her hearing. She was later asked, if you could have your hearing or your sight, which would you pick? Which would you pick if you lost them both, your sight, your hearing? I'd probably pick my sight. But she was so good at feeling things, touch feel, she called it, with her fingers, that she wanted her hearing. Very interesting from a person that never got to hear or couldn't see. She picked hearing because she said, "I've never been able to hear my mother's voice." That was the reason she gave. She's 17 years old, and she's writing the editor of the Boston newspaper, and she's trying to set up a tea for poor little sightless children. And she says, "I'm trying to raise money to help build a pleasant, cheerful home for poor little sightless children." Now, she's 17 years old. How many 17-year-olds do you know that's trying to do something like this at that time, where they will be tenderly and wisely cared for? Many helpless little boys and girls are now waiting to enter the kindergarten, but there's no room for them. These little human plantlets need the sunshine of the child's garden to grow in. I want the kind people of Boston, who has already done so much to brighten the lives of these helpless little ones, to come to my tea and buy light. the precious light of love and knowledge for those who are still in darkness. Surely they will come and hasten the joyful day when all little afflicted children will have a sunny corner in the child's garden where they can grow in goodness and beauty. Then their minds will open like beautiful flowers, and their hearts will be filled with love and gratitude to those dear friends who led them out of darkness in the beautiful sunlight of knowledge. When I bought that letter, my 7-year-old son was in a coma. And that letter helped me get through that period. I'd like to I don't know if you can see the writing on this photograph, but you can come take a look at it. The fact she could write at all is amazing, but she learned to write with templates. Like my dad, the architect, there, the letters are square. And it was a laborious process, so when the Braille typewriter came in, she typed everything. But she couldn't type it on the photograph. To Reverend Cornelius Greenway, one of the great collectors who had a church in New York City. And she writes, "I look forward to the world to come, where all physical limitations will drop from me like shackles, where I shall again find my beloved teacher, engaged joyously in greater service than I've yet known," Helen Keller. President Grant invited her to the tabernacle as Alexander Schreiner played "Come, Come, Ye Saints." They allowed her in 1938 to put her ear against the reverberations of the organ. She said, "That's a beautiful hymn, I can tell that." She couldn't hear it, but she could tell that. They gave her a standing ovation, and President Grant called her a great lady. Years later, President David O. McKay called her the greatest woman of the age. Nice tribute to a woman who started out with not too much of a promising future without sight and hearing. And she did learn eventually how to speak, but not well without your hearing. All right, I'm jumping to Ira Hayes. Well, let me first talk about Harry Truman. This is, I don't know if you can see, this is Battery D, World War I. If you can see Harry Truman on the second row, sort of in the middle, he was captain. This feisty little captain made some of the biggest decisions to end the Great War, World War II, with an atomic bomb which he knew nothing of until he became president. And at any rate, he said he felt like the sun, moon, and stars had fallen on him, but yet he had to make that decision. There's a letter here from Ira Hayes, who served in the war. I don't know how many of you knew that Truman actually had a prayer that he recited from the time he was a little boy. And he'd written this prayer in high school. He wrote it out for a friend, and I have a copy of it here. "O Almighty and everlasting God, creator of heaven and earth and the universe, help me to think, to act what is right because it is right. Make me truthful, honest, and honorable in all things. Make me intellectually honest for the sake of right and honor, and without thought of reward to me. Give me the ability to be charitable, forgiving, and patient with my fellow men. Help me to understand their motives and their shortcomings, even as thou understandest mine." Amen, amen, amen. I had an opportunity when we were first married to go down to the Pima Indian Reservation and meet the parents of a man who had raised the flag at Iwo Jima. And this is the photo over here. Now, I won't be able to talk about all these things. Their time's up, but I started 15 minutes late, but unless you want me to go any further. But, I understand. I'll go to 12? Okay, thank you. So if you don't want me, you can walk out, I guess. But I'm having fun. I hope some of you like some of this too. But thank you very much. At any rate, my father was at Iwo Jima. And the other story that got me collecting was my father's story of how, as a CB, construction battalion, he had transferred to the USS Salt Lake City. So he was born and raised here, and he felt like that's as close to home as he get through in the big war. He's one of only 6 men aboard the Salt Lake City that he knew of that were from Salt Lake City. It was a heavy cruiser. It was a 1920s era heavy cruiser. It had the biggest guns in the Navy. It was a cruiser, but it had battleship 8-inch guns. Dad says at Iwo Jima, this little battle, that for 120 days, the Pacific Fleet surrounded this little island, 3 miles wide, 16 miles long, with one mountain, volcanic mountain, Suribachi, where they raised that flag. They took the hill first, but they had to fight their way to the top because the enemy at that time had a tunnel system going right up the mountain as well as all throughout the island. That island had 3 airstrips we had to have if we were going to attack Japan, because it was only 700 miles from Tokyo. We had to be within that distance to be able to do that. So we needed that island, and they needed to save it, to keep it. Over 6,000 Americans, mostly Navy and Marines, they were all part of the Navy then, and Army, died trying to take that. There were over 20,000 casualties, but 6,000 died trying to take that little piece of real estate. And over 20,000 Japanese died, ultimately, in trying to keep it. Those of you that saw the movie based on the book Flags of My Fathers know something about it. But at any rate, the point was my dad told me that the day before the flag raising, they took the mountain first, and then they had the big battle for the island. But they wanted the Marines, they wanted the Navy and others to see, as they were hitting the shores, our flag. And they'd never raised one during the war quite like this. AP photographer Joe from the San Francisco Chronicle was there, and he took the famous picture. He didn't think he got anything because the movie tone guy stood right in front of him, just he had to jerk his camera. And so the negative of this, first Pulitzer Prize winning photo, and the most famous photo of World War II, which the firemen tried to redo at 9/11, you may remember. He didn't think he got it, but the photo, the part of the negative that he got this picture on was down in the lower right-hand corner of the negative. And it was perfect. He found that when he got to Manila the next day and got his film developed. Well, President Roosevelt, FDR this time, saw it and wanted those men taken off the island. One interesting story you may not know, the day after my dad was slightly wounded, he used to joke about the gyrenes. The services still like to kind of, needle each other, and they were all part of Navy then. No separate Marine Corps, although they had a commandant, Mad Helen Smith. And my dad said the next day they were along the plank of the Salt Lake City, the side bay, and someone was passing some binoculars down and said, "Look, they got a Jeep up on top." And shortly thereafter, it wasn't his turn for the binoculars when the flag went up, but it was big enough for him to see, and it was like the little postage stamp he saw later. Well, many of you know there were two flag raisings, and the first one was a small flag nobody could see. So Mad Helen Smith, the commandant of the Marine Corps, told them to go get a ship's flag off an LST. So they went down to the LST that was nearest to them, and a young man by the name of A. Theodore Tuttle, you ever heard that name? Ran that flag up to those boys that stuck that flag up, okay? So this has an LDS connection, all right? And my father could see that flag going up, and my father and everyone that I know that served under our flag were always the first to stand up at parades and other things when the flag was being honored. The only heroes of the war in their mind were their buddies that didn't come home. At any rate, I went down and met Ira Hayes, the Pima Indian that has his hands up like this in the picture. His parents, not him, because he died. But it was the year after we were married, and Job Hayes went out and brought a couple of letters from Ira that he'd sent home and gave them to me. One that had the stamp on it later I gave to a close friend. The one that didn't have a stamp, but I thought I wanted to keep, was this one, which I'm sharing with you. And it's a little difficult to read, but about two-thirds down, "Oh hum," he's writing this, folks and family. "Oh hum, the life of a Marine, always on the go. No wonder we're such wondrous fighting men with guns and skill and faith towards our God." Years later, John F. Kennedy was president, and he had just been wet behind the ears as president. He had been a World War II hero, as many of you know, PT 109. That story, incidentally, was published by Reader's Digest in 1946, right after the war, right before he was a congressman. And he was a war hero, no question about it. But now he's president in 61, and he made his first trip to Vienna to meet Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union. We're in the midst of the Cold War. Khrushchev told him that really talked down to the young man because he was a World War I vet, and he was talking to a World War II vet. And he told him we're going to build a wall in Berlin. And he did. This is 1961. Kennedy's flying back, and his secretaries woke up. They're flying across the Atlantic, spent a couple of days visiting with Prime Minister Macmillan in England, and then they had to fly back. And Kennedy was preparing a talk to the American people, which I still remember on the old black and white, explaining what happened. Now, he felt like he'd been kind of beat up by the Soviet premier at their first meeting and challenged. And so Mrs. Lincoln, his secretary, whom I got this note from, this is a letter to the Pope, incidentally, that she gave me. Well, I purchased it, but it was a letter to the Pope. who we didn't get to meet because Pope John died a few days later. I guess I didn't copy this one, but at any rate, we'll put the letter of the Pope on. But Mrs. Lincoln was woke up, and she was to see the president in his cabin. She went in, and the president had papers strewn around, she told me. And he was kind of laying on his desk when he raised up when she knocked, and said, "Mrs. Lincoln, would you please remove my papers?" So she did from the desk, and then she noticed one little sheet that was down by the door on the floor. And she took them all back to her seat to file in her little file that she kept for the president. And then she read this little note that was on the floor, and she kept it. And she wrote notes, June 1961. In Kennedy's writing, he writes, "I know there is a God, and I see a storm coming. If he has a place for me, I believe that I am ready. And I call this preparation to defend freedom." Kennedy later went to Berlin, and on the day I got my patriarchal blessing, as I remember fasting all day as a 14-year-old, he gave his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, which years later I bid on when it came up for auction. And I lost out. Just didn't have quite enough money to get it. I wanted it, but I found out it was Jacqueline Kennedy that beat me. And it went to the John F. Kennedy Library thereafter. Interesting stories in collecting. The next one here is Ronald Reagan. Reagan was governor, as you know, of California before he was president, and during that period of time, he would write on the bottom of letters he wanted to respond to. Someone had written him, this Morris Davis, about the recent Supreme Court decision a couple years before to ban prayer in the schools. And Reagan would write a note, and then his secretary would type it up. And this is one of the notes he wrote on this letter. "If I thought there was ever evidence of a clear and present threat to religious freedom or our tradition of separation of power of church and state, I would understand the ban on prayer in the schools. I don't think such a threat exists. My disagreement with the Supreme Court decision is based on my fear that this is one more step in downgrading our spiritual heritage and encouraging materialism. Sincerely, R.R." Finally, I would like to end with my favorite autograph. And you say, it's approaching 1 million items because I got 250,000+ books, and documents are about the same, and artifacts are growing fast. I don't know how many I've got, but I know I have to go on a hunt every time I'm looking for something, because I remember that I had something on this. So it's getting kind of bad for my family too, because they know when I'm on a search, which is about every other day. But this one I know where it is, and it is my favorite autograph. This is written by the prophet Joseph Smith. He has just done what the Lord directed. He'd gone to the governor, Missouri, gone to the judge first and the governor, and had no help on getting their lands back, so he's told to go back to the Congress. He does. They turn him down. He meets Van Buren, the president, says, as you know, your cause is just, but I can do nothing for you. If I help you, I'll have to help the whole state of Missouri, and that's a unique idea for any politician. I'm sure glad politics has improved over the years. At any rate, he goes on to Philadelphia, and they rent a big hall, and the church historical department found out which church that was. It still stands. And the Philadelphia Inquirer, which I think, unless it went under, is still a paper, Philadelphia, all these many years later, it invited people to come listen to the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith. He's going to make a speech in this church Sunday. The barbarian of the West, they called him. This got a lot of curiosity up. And so over 2,000 people showed up at that church. Joseph gave a great talk. Unfortunately, we don't have a word for word, but we know it was all about family. Much like Teddy Roosevelt and others have written about that I've talked to you here, only he was a prophet, and he was responding to what the Lord had asked him to speak of. He'd seen men sitting and lying around bars around town as he come in. He'd seen women and children that didn't have any support at home. And he made a real telling call to all of these to get back home and do what they should be doing, raise their families and so on. A very family-centered talk, which I believe, although we don't have every word of it, would have fit great in the conference that just ended, okay? So I don't think the Lord's purposes have changed very much in all these years. At any rate, at the end of their visit, he stayed with a woman by the name of Sally Wilkinson, who was not a member, but she joined the church soon after his talk. She was so impressed. And she asked the prophet, and Judge Higbee was the only one he had with him at this time, because Porter Rockwell had to turn around and take Hiram, who got ill, back home to Commerce at the time, or Nauvoo as it became. And she asked the prophet if he would write down something in her autograph book. I chased this document around the United States for probably about 15 years. Saw it early 70s with my brother in California. I went to Chicago, ultimately New York, and then Boston, and got it there. It's on virtue, and it's a statement the prophet didn't have a scribe for, so he sat in and wrote it in his own handwriting. And as Dean Jesse told me, out of the approximate 5,000 pages that we have of Joseph Smith that he authored, less than 50 of them, if you discount the journals he wrote, less than 50 of them are in his own handwriting, and this is one of those. He'd just gotten out of Liberty Prison and written about virtue garnishing our thoughts and so on. He said, virtue is one of the most prominent principles that enables us to have confidence in approaching our Father who is in heaven. And I'd have to say this letter stands for confidence through virtue. That gives us confidence to approach our Father who is in heaven in order to ask wisdom at his hand. Therefore, and it gets scriptural, therefore, if thou wilt cherish this principle in thine heart, thou mayest ask with all confidence before him, and it shall be poured out upon thine head, and thou shalt not lack anything that thy soul desires in truth. What a promise. And again, the Lord shall bless this house, and none of them shall fail, because they turn not away the servants of the Lord from their doors. He had a lot of doors shut in his face around the country the weeks before. And he just got out of another door, Liberty Jail. Because they turn not away the servants of the Lord from their doors, even so, amen. Joseph Smith, Jr. You feel the Spirit? Every time I read that, I feel the Spirit. It's from a man that had very little education, but had more education than the rest of us on heaven and how that works. And finally, just like to end with this. Our time's up. Joseph is on his way to Carthage. And those of you that have been to the rebuilt Nauvoo temples, I have, noticed there's some beautiful sculptures of Joseph and Hiram on horseback there by the temple. And he's looking over the town as he did, and he's telling Hiram, this is the best people, best place on earth, paraphrase, but little do they know about what they're to go through. And there was more persecution coming, as you know, including the deaths of both the brothers and sealing their testimonies. At any rate, Joseph and the city council were under indictment to give themselves up on a charge of riot, a legal charge of riot for causing a riot at the destruction of the Nauvoo Expositor Press. Some people were screaming freedom of speech, freedom of the press, but the law nailed him with a charge of riot. There was no riot. It was all carried out very peacefully at the time. In fact, my great aunt Ardell, before she died, she told me, she said her grandfather, Appleton Harmon, told her as a little girl around 1900, before he died, that he and his father, Jesse P., had thrown the press in the river. Never read that anywhere. But I guess I'm going on tape here because I think somebody ought to dredge it. He says, if somebody ever comes up with the Expositor Press, make sure it's awful rusty, because me and my father Jesse threw it in the river. Well, you know, Joseph at first escaped to a little island that was on in Nauvoo. A lot of people wonder where that island went when they visit Nauvoo, but the Keokuk Dam raised the level of the water quite a bit over the island, so it's not there. Joseph thought if he and Hiram and the others in the city council got out of the crosshairs of what was being written by Warsaw Signal and other things, went to this island that maybe it'd blow over, but it didn't blow over. And Emma sent a letter via Porter Rockwell, his protector, the young man who thought of Joseph as his big brother, who would have given his life and taken 20 people with him, but Joseph got him out of the way at the time of the assassination. And you may recall that Joseph and Hiram had this discussion about leaving, about going back, giving themselves up. Hiram said, well, the Lord will get you off. And Hiram said something to the effect of, well, we'll go back, but we'll be butchered, we'll be murdered, which I'm sure is not what Hiram had in mind. And at any rate, he said he wished he could get Hiram out of the way, but as you saw the great discourse on Oliver Cowdery, who was second elder and probably should have sealed his testimony with Joseph, but was not in the church at the time, his big brother Hiram was always a stalwart, always stood by him, always protected him, much like Alvin, their older brother, had done before. Went to his death. And you recall they said goodbyes to their families. They looked over the town and said what I told you, and then they headed down Mulholland past the unfinished temple to Carthage, the den of thieves. The governor was there. Ford, President Hinckley, spoke eloquently about his heritage. And I had a son that was a horse thief and hung and so on. He was part of a conspiracy to end the prophet's life. And they got 4 miles outside of Carthage. They got to the Albert G. Fellows farmhouse. And Joseph had the city council with him. They were watering their horses before they head on the last 4 miles. And it was 10 minutes to 10 o'clock a.m. when a bunch of militia come up with this piece of paper I've got in my hand. And they handed it to the prophet. And basically what it was an order by Thomas Ford. The signature of Ford's been torn off of it. Wilford Woodruff brought this back to Utah, incidentally, along with a piece of the prophet's mother's hair and a piece of scarf he wore at Carthage. I got all 3 of those now, but it was a while before I got them. But the point was that Joseph was handed this paper, and on it says that by Ford he's got to disarm his legion. Joseph had no hesitancy. They sent 60 armed men to enforce this against the prophet. They didn't need a single one of them. The prophet had always said, if we want to make a change, we do it at the ballot box. We don't do it at the end of a gun or a bayonet. Here he is standing solid when he knows he's going to his death. He's standing solid on those principles. And as he was handed this paper, he turned to the others. He wrote his military order, last novel legion, to disarm his own legion. Signed it. This is his 3rd to last known autograph. And then Dunn made him go back with him and disarm the legion and come back. So that's why he didn't make it to Carthage before midnight. Okay, 2 trips there that day. But the important part I want to end with is that when he was handed this paper, he turned to his brethren and said, I now go as a lamb to the slaughter. And this is why I love collecting this kind of stuff. It brings these people to life, these great men and women that we all love to read about. And I end with my testimony that I know Joseph Smith is a prophet. And I know that Thomas Monson is a prophet today, just like each of the ones in between. Harold B. Lee was a good family friend that served on a high council with my grandfather years ago. And he had a daughter, Maureen, of his 2 daughters by his first marriage that lived in our ward. In fact, way back then I was a ward organist, don't tell anybody. And my mother was the music director, but Maureen would come up, and as a teenage boy, she would congratulate me, even though I tried to blast everybody out of church like some teenage boys that get their hands on an organ do. And Harold B. Lee, when he became the prophet, drove into their driveway, neighbors of ours, and a good friend, an entomologist from BYU, Burl Ullman, saw the new prophet, get out of his car, and he went over to him and he congratulated him on becoming our prophet. And President Lee said, there's only one prophet in this dispensation. The rest of us are mere caretakers. He learned an interesting lesson. I bury in my testimony, I know Joseph is a prophet, and that the mere caretakers are also prophets. And I'm grateful to my Heavenly Father that I've been able to collect these things and that I've been led to many of them. We took over 130,000 items to the church archives and the church history library over the 7 years of my 2 missions there. My mission was to bring my stuff up. So we didn't get through it all, but we brought a lot of stuff up. And it was, when he died, I was told it was President Hinckley that had suggested that to Marlon Jensen. He told me that later. President Hinckley I had a great relationship with over the years of the 80s and 90s. I bear you my testimony, I know these brethren are prophets. I bear you my testimony that there are other prophets not of our faith or prophetesses that leave us great ideas and great thoughts that bring us also back to God, and I hope we will use them. And I say it humbly in Jesus' name, amen.